The first time I saw the Dominion battlecruiser Valiant Forge, she was hanging over a Zerg-held world like an executioner's blade. Burned Zerg hive clusters glowed on the night side below, and the ship's armored belly was streaked with charred creep and acid scoring from earlier passes. They told us service aboard a frontline Terran capital ship was safer than groundside, but nobody explained why the safer option looked like it had already died once and been welded back together. Our personnel shuttle was a buzzing speck beside her. We drifted along the spine past point defense turrets and missile bays, past rough slabs of replacement armor where spore impacts had punched through the original hull. From the small viewing port by my seat, I could see the seam lines, bright against Dominion red, like scars that hadn't finished healing. The docking jaws opened and swallowed us. Floodlights washed across the shuttle, then across our faces as the hatch cycled open and the boarding bay swallowed us in turn. The air tasted of burned propellant and hot metal, with a faint chemical sting that never quite covered the memory of Zerg matter that had once gotten this far. Bulkhead panels near the outer doors were rippled and discolored, as if something had hit them at speed and tried very hard to keep going. Petty officers in Dominion gray moved us into columns, data pads glowing in their hands. Marines in full CMC armor stood along the walls, visors down, rifles clamped to their chests. Every time the deck vibrated under my boots, I imagined some fresh impact outside, until the rhythm settled into a steady, cyclical pulse, the idle heartbeat of a reactor running just below combat load. Hollow signs flickered over our heads: engineering, hangar, fire control, medical. I followed the arrow for fire control with the other techs, all of us carrying identical duffels and uniforms that still creaked at the seams. Above the signs, someone had stenciled the ship's name on the bulkhead in large, chipped letters. Beneath it, in smaller, unofficial paint, another hand had added, "Never docks." That was the first story I heard about the Forge, written right there on the metal. Supposedly, she'd been on the Zerg front so long she'd forgotten what a real shipyard looked like. Rumor said she only ever paused to skim fuel from automated depots or hook up to skeletal orbital platforms that were half evacuation hub, half morgue. Looking around the boarding bay at the mismatched plating and the way the lights dipped when the thrusters fired, I believed it. "Eyes front," a voice snapped. The chief petty officer for fire control stepped up onto a loading crate so we could all see him. His hair was regulation short, his face cross-hatched with fine lines, a thin strip of rank gleaming at his collar like a warning light. "Congratulations," he said. "You've been assigned to the Valiant Forge. If you do your jobs and the Zerg stay lazy, you might live long enough to transfer somewhere worse." A few people laughed. The chief didn't. He walked us through the basics: section assignments, watch rotations, how long a standard tour was supposed to be and how often it actually ran over. We were warned about contamination drills, blackout orders, and what to do if internal alarms ever announced isolation doors closing between us and an external breach. The words came out crisp and memorized, polished by repetition, like this was the 50th intake just like ours. When he said fire control technicians, I felt my shoulders tense. That was my line on the slate. Take targeting solutions from orbital recon and groundside spotters, translate them into firing sequences for the main batteries, trust the guns to do the rest. The forge could turn a Zerg hive cluster into glass from low orbit if the coordinates were right. If they were wrong, the mistake would happen somewhere I would never see, and someone else would pay for it. We filed out of the boarding bay into the arteries of the ship. The corridors were narrower than the recruitment vids had promised, more like industrial service tunnels than heroic passageways. Deck plating shifted underfoot, where sections had been replaced, the joins visible as pale lines and uneven seams. In a few stretches, the walls bowed inward, bent by old impacts and braced instead of replaced. We passed one hatch that was triple sealed, warning stripes scorched dark at the edges. A faded biohazard pictogram showed through beneath newer paint, and someone had welded a thin strip of metal over the manual release. Nobody remarked on it. The chief kept talking about muster points, and we all pretended the sealed hatch was just part of the layout, and not a place where something had gone wrong fast. The enlisted berths for our deck were wedged between a coolant conduit trunk and one of the primary cargo elevators. My bunk was a narrow coffin stacked 3 high, curtain, net, the usual. The air carried a permanent hint of machine oil and recycled sweat. Someone had carved shift tallies into the underside of the bunk frame above mine, grouped scratches marching in rows long enough that I stopped counting. "You get used to it," the tech in the next bunk said, as I stowed my bag. He looked older than the file picture I'd glimpsed on the intake slate, eyes dulled by the kind of exhaustion that didn't go away with sleep. Noise, smell, jump shutters. Just don't sleep with your boots off when we're on approach. I asked why before I thought better of it. He shrugged. If the alarms sound and you start barefoot, you stay behind or you slip in someone else's blood. Either way, it's bad. He said it like he was talking about weather. Orientation continued on the move. We were marched past the mess hall, packed, noisy, a smear of gray uniforms and clattering trays, and past a wall of photos and etched nameplates that I realized too late was the memorial for those who hadn't rotated off. The most recent plates still had fresh tool marks. There were a lot of recent plates. The main fire control deck sat just aft and below the bridge, a dim cavern lined with console pits and hollow projectors. That first day, we only got a glimpse from the entry gantry. Rows of chairs bolted to the deck with harness points for full alert status. Cables rising to tactical displays overhead. At the center, a raised platform held the primary targeting table, a translucent slab already showing the roiling clouds and thermal signatures of the world below us. From that vantage, the infestation on the surface looked abstract. Data clusters and shifting clouds of color marked where Zerg biosigns seethed across continents, radiation spikes showing where previous strikes had gouged into the crust. It was easy to imagine that our job would just be numbers and vectors and clean beams arcing down into that mass, with no faces attached on either side. By the time they cut us loose back to berthing, I had the beginnings of a mental map of the ship and a clearer sense of my place inside it. Somewhere between the bridge and the bulkheads that kept the vacuum out, a small human node in a network of steel and circuitry. The forge had survived longer than it should have in this war zone. The unofficial motto under her name suggested why. She wasn't meant to go home. None of us were, not really. Lights dimmed by a fraction as I lay back in my bunk, boots still on, hands folded over my chest. The vibration under me shifted into the sharper hum I'd felt during transit, the signature of engines preparing for a course correction or something bigger. Overhead, the carved tallies were just visible in the low light, cut lines marching onward until they ran out of space and started again in a new row. Somewhere far above on the bridge, someone was confirming new orders, new coordinates, another piece of the Zerg front added to that hovering slab of light. We hadn't even finished the intake briefings and already the ship was turning, guns and engines lining up on another burning world. Out here, the war was never somewhere else. It lived in the hull, in the air, in the way the forge never really stopped moving. The first time the forge fired her main guns while I was on duty, the entire deck seemed to lurch sideways before the inertial dampeners caught up. The vibration came up through my boots, through the harness, and into my teeth, followed half a heartbeat later by the muted thunder of capacitors dumping into the spinal mounts. After that, the ship just hummed louder, like it had remembered what it was built for. Fire control smelled of ozone and stale coffee. The overheads were always a notch dimmer than the corridors outside, so the glow from the consoles and the main holotable flattened everyone's faces into pale masks. From my station on the lower ring, I could see the planetary projection hanging over the central pit, a Zerg-held world rotating under our guns. Continents washed in thermal gradients and biosign overlays. Hive clusters marked as bright knots of hostile mass. Our job, they kept reminding us, was simple. The bridge and the recon drones handled targeting priorities. Ghosts on the surface or in orbit handled precision calls when they were available. We turned all of that into solutions the main batteries could understand. Inputs in, fire sequences out. No heroics, no judgment. The forge was a weapon, and we were just finer grain parts of the trigger. The watch chief for our shift stood on the central platform, one hand on the railing as another salvo cycled. His eyes never left the firing status displays, a constantly shifting grid of coolant levels, charge states, barrel health, and targeting locks. He didn't flinch when new impact markers flared on the surface render below, just flicked his gaze to the next set of cued coordinates. "Track Delta 3, confirm solution," he said. That line wasn't meant for me, but my shoulders tightened anyway. My console showed a narrower slice of the battle. One hemisphere of the planet, a cluster of Zerg biosigns pushing along a river valley toward a beleaguered Dominion outpost. Our task on my strip was suppression, not annihilation. Enough fire to slow the advance, not so much that we removed the ground the outpost was standing on. I checked the predicted dispersal patterns, the local elevation data, the red safety cones that marked where our own troops had decided they'd like to keep existing. The coordinates we'd been fed passed every automated check. I approved the firing plan, and the guns answered with another shuddering heartbeat. There's a delay built into orbital fire. Even at the ranges a battlecruiser could work, light still has to travel. Beams still have to push through atmosphere or skim at shallow angles along a planet's curve. You can fire and then second-guess yourself for a full breath before the impacts register on the recon feeds. In that breath, I sat strapped to my station and thought about Marines on the ground who had no such buffer between action and consequence. "Impacts on grid," someone called from the recon cluster. On my display, bright spears of energy intersected the advancing Zerg blips. A swath of the valley turned into a smear of superheated rock and vapor, and the wavefront of biosigns thinned, staggered, then split as the swarm reoriented around the new obstacles. A dozen Dominion transponder pings confirmed they were still active, their signals ragged, moving, alive. The chief nodded once. "Cycle to next," he said. "Stay ahead of the wave." That was the rhythm of the shift. Calls from below, solutions, firing, impacts, adjust. The deck vibrated, then settled. The holotable updated in jerks as the planet turned. Every few minutes, the ship tweaked its orbit or attitude to bring a different firing angle into play, and the dampeners lagged just enough to remind us we were dragging thousands of tons of metal through a gravity well that did not want us there. Hairline faults showed up in our routines the longer the bombardment went on. A targeting subroutine on one of the auxiliary consoles started throwing checksum errors and had to be rebooted mid-sequence. A bank of status lights in the overhead flickered every time the main capacitors cycled to full, casting intermittent shadows like the deck was breathing too fast. Someone in engineering rerouted power to compensate, and the shadows steadied. But the hum from the deck plates picked up a new, higher note. At one point, the sensor feed stuttered, and for half a second, the hive clusters on the surface vanished from our projections entirely, replaced by a ghost image of a different world with different constellations in its sky. The overlay flashed unfamiliar energy signatures at the planetary horizon, sharp, angular patterns in the field equations that I only recognized later as Protoss. Then the glitch resolved. The Zerg swarms snapped back into existence, and the watch chief's voice cut across the deck. "Mark that timestamp," he said. "Comms, log it as sensor interference from radiant phenomena. Classification pending." He spoke like someone who had logged a similar event more than once and didn't want to argue with anyone about it. Later, off shift, I heard people in the mess muttering about Templar ghosts at the edge of the sector, about how the Forge had once strayed too close to one of their exclusion zones and come away with half its sensor suite burned out. Officially, we weren't supposed to be anywhere near Protoss lines. Officially, a lot of things were true. Between firing cycles, there were stretches of waiting that somehow felt worse. No one talked much. A cough here, the clack of keys, the quiet snap of harness buckles being adjusted. The only constant sound was the murmur of filtered comms. Groundside units reporting contact. Bridge officers relaying adjusted priorities. Engineering calling up minor status updates that never quite rose to the level of emergency. The first contamination drill of my assignment hit in the middle of one of those lulls. The siren was a descending tone that cut straight through the deck noise, followed by the clipped voice of the ship's AI repeating, "Biohazard protocol in effect. All hands stand by for isolation." Alarms flared red along the edges of my console. A schematic of the Forge appeared in a side panel, one section near the forward starboard hangar, outlined in flashing yellow. The readouts beside it showed external hull impact, minor penetration, unknown residue detected on inner plating. The drill insisted we treat it as if Zerg matter had punched through. The procedures were automatic. Seal the section, vent if necessary, reroute personnel if necessary. Wait. On the fire control deck, nothing moved except people's eyes. The hatch indicators along the walls flicked to locked. The siren ran its cycle twice, then cut. A moment later, the AI chimed again, this time with the word simulation appended to the alert. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The harness creaked under my shoulders. On the central platform, the watch chief didn't relax. "Assume the next one isn't a drill," he said, to no one in particular. Later, when I took a meal in the mess, I passed the stretch of corridor outside the forward hangar where the simulated breach had supposedly occurred. The bulkhead there was slightly darker than the metal around it, a broad panel that had clearly been replaced more recently. Someone had traced a thin, branching line across the new plating with a grease pencil, curling like Zerg creep reaching outward. Underneath, a single word had been scratched into the paint. Again. On the wall opposite, the memorial had new plates. I recognized none of the names, but the dates etched below them overlapped with our current deployment. Someone had left a Marine's battered helmet on the narrow shelf beneath, its visor spider-webbed with a crack that ran right through the center. A small dongle hanging from the chin guard showed the unit sigil for one of the groundside detachments we'd been supporting earlier that shift. The forge ran on routines, but those routines were built from someone else's emergencies, compacted and stacked until they looked like order from the outside. In the bunk later, engine hum under my spine, I realized I was already tracking time not by clocks or shift rotations, but by firing cycles, by when the main guns spoke and when they fell silent. Life aboard was becoming a series of before and after images in my head. The valley before we burned it and after. The corridor before the replacement panel and after. The memorial before those plates and after. Serving on a Dominion battlecruiser in a Zerg Warzone, I was beginning to understand, meant learning to live inside those transitions and pretend they were normal. The voices on the ground channel sounded thin and distant through the fire control headsets when the mission that mattered most came in late. Static nipped at the edges of each word, turning the Marines' call signs into clipped syllables and their situation reports into fragments. Behind their speech, I could hear the roar of weapons on full auto and the wet, chittering undertone of Zerg that had gotten far too close. We were back on station over the same world, new orbit, new angle. The hive clusters we'd glassed earlier were still visible on the holotable, as cooled scars, ringed by new growth where the swarm had flowed around the damage. A reinforced Dominion outpost sat just inside one of those rings, its transponder beacon pulsing like a stubborn heartbeat in hostile tissue. The mission came flagged as priority override. That tag slid across my console and cut ahead of the other queued fire plans in an instant. Groundside, a company of Marines and armored support had been tasked with pushing into one of the gaps we'd burned, punching through to seize a node that mattered to someone higher up the chain. On the surface, things had gone sideways. "Command, this is Hammer 2, requesting immediate orbital fire. Grid 86 by 32, repeat, requesting fire on our position." We weren't supposed to hear that phrasing often. It meant the line between the enemy and the Marines had dissolved to the point where distinctions were more dangerous than friendly fire. It meant the math of survival had narrowed to an ugly choice. Lose everyone under that coordinate block, or lose more later when the Zerg broke through. The watch chief snapped his fingers once, sharp. "Routing now," he said. "Verify coordinates, check safeties, priority over all other tasks." The numbers came up on my display. They matched the outpost's perimeter, overlapped multiple known friendly transponders, cut directly through the densest knot of hostile biosigns pressing against the walls. My training said the coordinates made sense. Every part of me that had grown up on a frontier world under Terran skies recoiled anyway. I ran the checks. The safety cones flashed scarlet and then waited for authorization beyond my clearance. On the central platform, the chief's hand hovered over the confirmation field, not yet touching it. Up on the bridge, someone else was staring at the same numbers, weighing them against whatever doctrine and politics applied. Groundside, the Marines didn't have time for deliberation. Zerg breaching the north sector, we are black on ammo. Repeat, we are black on... The rest dissolved into a roar that might have been gunfire, might have been the sound of a wall coming down. The line went dead for a beat, and then came back in shorter bursts. Different voices, different panicked fragments. We weren't supposed to attach names to those tones. They were just elements in a calculation. When the higher authorization finally arrived, it did so as a small green change in the indicator at the top of my console. That was all. A color shift that turned a desperate request into an approved fire plan. "Orders confirmed," the chief said, voice flat. "Execute." My hands moved. They found the familiar sequence of confirmations, the toggles that turned raw coordinates into trajectories and firing angles. On the holotable, a projected box settled over the outpost, encompassing both the swarm outside and the clusters of friendlies still moving inside the walls. The guns were already charged, waiting, their capacitors screaming their readiness in the background of the ship's noise. "Solution locked," I said, because that was the phrase you used. The deck kicked under us as the spinal mounts discharged. I watched the predicted impact markers descend along their arcs, bright threads plunging through atmosphere toward a point on the surface none of us would ever stand on. It took less than a second for the beams to cross the distance, long enough for me to imagine Marines looking up at a sky that had turned briefly brighter than anything they'd seen before. The recon feed updated, delayed by its own transmission lag. For a moment, the outpost and the swarm were just a blinding flare on the projection, washing out the landscape around them. Then the light faded. The biosign overlays recalculated. There was a crater where the fortress had been. A new wound burned into the Zerg's living terrain. The hostile counts in the area dropped sharply, then began to tick up again at the edges as the swarm flowed inward to occupy the new shape. The friendly transponders inside the box were gone. No one spoke. The fire control deck buzzed with status updates for other sectors, other missions, but there was a pocket of silence around the part of the hollow table that had just been overwritten. The chief tapped the railing once with his knuckles, a small, sharp sound, and then turned to the next incoming request. "Cycle to secondary objectives," he said. "Keep firing." The war did not wait for anyone's feelings. We ran through the rest of the shift like we always did. Coordinates, checks, firing, impacts. My hands moved when they were supposed to. My voice reported what it needed to. But a part of my attention stayed fixed on the blank space where the outpost had been. As the planet turned, that patch of ground rotated out of view, replaced by other scars and active fronts. Out of sight was not the same as gone. Off watch, the forge's interior felt different. In the mess, one of the screens that usually cycled through muted entertainments and propaganda reels was dark, its feed replaced by a rotating roster of unit sigils and names. Marines stood in small clusters, helmets on the table beside their trays. their armor still dusted with red dirt from shuttle landings that hadn't been followed by deployment. No one needed to tell us those ground detachments had been slated for reinforcement at the outpost we'd just erased. The casualty lists were still being compiled, but the pattern was obvious from who was missing. One table by the viewport sat untouched, its trays stacked at the end, a few personal items left where their owners had last put them down. A folded deck of cards, a battered metal mug, a small data slate with its screen frozen on a half-finished message. In the corridor outside the mess, a new sheet of metal had been bolted to the memorial wall, blank. The tools to etch it were already hanging from the hooks beneath. You didn't need a chaplain or an officer to update that surface. The Forge trusted the people who remained to mark the ones who didn't. I found one of the names from the roster later, tucked into a corner of the etched plates. It matched the sigil on the cracked helmet I'd seen beneath the wall outside the hangar, and a small annotation had been added next to it. Lost with unit. Grid 86 by 32. Somebody had decided the coordinates mattered enough to record. That night in my bunk, the engine hum underneath me felt too loud. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the box on the holotable. The way it had contained both friendly and hostile signals, as if they were equal and exchangeable. The training manuals insisted orbital fire was a clean solution compared to ground combat, that separating yourself from the mud and the blood kept your judgment intact. From where I lay, boots still on, I couldn't see a clean line anywhere. Serving aboard the Forge meant accepting that some decisions lived far above my clearance level. It also meant I could no longer pretend that distance made me innocent. The ship might never dock, but its shadow reached all the way down to those grid coordinates, and so did mine. The first impact felt like someone had swung a giant hammer into the spine of the ship. I woke to my bunk frame shuddering against my shoulders and the overhead lighting snapping from sleep dim to full combat red. The ever-present hum of the Forge's systems sharpened into a higher, angrier pitch, and somewhere distant, point defense batteries started their stuttering percussion. I was already in my boots. Muscle memory had learned that lesson early. I shoved the curtain aside and dropped to the deck with a dozen other bodies doing the same. The air in the berth was hot and metallic, tasting of ozone and sweat as we pulled on harness vests and sealed collar tags that would tell the ship where our bodies were if the worst happened. The corridor outside was a river of motion. Klaxons pulsed through the metal, their rhythm different from the contamination drill's descending tone. This was the alarm they used when something external and hostile was close enough to touch us. Status strips along the bulkheads flashed between red and amber, showing sections going to lockdown in sequence like falling dominoes. Over the shipnet, the AI's voice rolled in clipped bursts, announcing impact vectors, hull integrity reports, and compartment isolations. I caught enough fragments to assemble the picture. Zerg strike craft, mutalisks and scourge, riding the gravity well up from the infested world below and flinging themselves at the Forge and the other ships in our group. We'd bombarded them hard enough that they wanted to return the favor. We were between watches, so my fire control section was officially off duty. In practice, that meant we were routed to a secondary muster point instead of directly to our consoles. The Forge didn't like leaving any space unaccounted for when something was hammering the hull. The muster point was a widened junction one deck below the forward hangar. As we reached it, the deck flexed under our feet with another impact, a deeper note this time, closer. The bulkheads around us creaked like an old ship in a storm. Overhead, dust shook loose from seam lines that had already seen too many repairs. We clipped our harness lines into the railings that lined the junction, joining the ring of bodies anchored there. Marines in full armor pounded past toward the hangar, mag boots slamming into the deck plates with a rhythm that matched the thud of distant flak. Further aft, I could hear the whine of launch catapults spitting interceptors into the void. For a while, the only thing we could do was stand there and listen to the ship work. The Forge's guns answered the attack, her point defense turrets tracking and firing, her escorts adding their own angry flickers to the black. None of that happened where I could see it. My world had narrowed to the trembling circle of red-lit metal around the muster point, the too-fast pulse in my throat, the faint tang of something burning in the air. When the breach call finally came, it hit like a pressure drop. The AI flagged a compartment near the forward starboard hangar. Hull penetration, atmosphere loss, unknown biomass in contact with internal surfaces. The schematic that bloomed on the nearest display showed a small, ugly star where something had punched through and stuck like a biting insect. The isolation doors between that section and ours were already closing. We felt the deck jerk as heavy shutters slammed into place deeper in the structure. A moment later, the air handling patterns shifted as the ventilation system rerouted itself, sealing off the contaminated space like a cauterized wound. We stayed where we were, harnesses clipped, while damage control and biohazard teams went to work. Through a small viewport at the end of the corridor, I caught a brief, disorienting glimpse, a sliver of the battle outside, the curve of the planet smeared with the light of surface fires, and something organic and wrong clinging to the Forge's hull. It was just a silhouette against the reflected glare of our own flak bursts, a knot of carapace and tendrils fused to the metal, but it made the skin on my arms crawl. The viewport auto-polarized a heartbeat later, blanking the sight. We were not supposed to stand and stare at the things trying to eat us. Updates filtered through the net in terse tags. External teams scored the clinging Zerg biomass with directed fire from inside the hull, boiling and blasting it away in layers while trying not to punch clean through and make the breach worse. Internal sensors scanned for contamination, spores in the air, residue on surfaces, anything that suggested the swarm had pushed a foothold beyond that one ugly star on the schematic. For now, the reading stayed in acceptable bands, whatever that meant on a ship that had already worn so many scars. Eventually, the alarm stepped down from solid red to pulsing amber. Our section was released from the muster point with orders to report in, check our assigned spaces, and watch for any sign that the biohazard systems had missed something. No one mentioned the possibility of spores that didn't show up on immediate scans. They didn't have to. On the way back toward fire control, we passed the corridor that led to the breached compartment. The heavy isolation door was shut, its frame scored with fresh welds where engineers had added extra bracing in a hurry. The hazard striping around the hatch looked newly applied, still bright and unscuffed, and someone had chalked a rough Zerg spine above the locking wheel. It wasn't gallows humor so much as an acknowledgement. Something had gotten that close. Next time, it might try a different direction. The forward hangar itself looked like a mouth that had bitten down on something too hard. One corner of the deck had buckled, the impact transferring through the hull and warping internal support struts. Maintenance crews moved among grounded dropships with scanners and patch kits, checking for hairline fractures in frames that would one day be asked to carry Marines down into gravity wells again. Near the hangar entrance, the triage area overflowed. Cots crowded the space that usually held cargo pallets, each one occupied by someone who had been standing in the wrong place when the ship shook. Broken bones, head wounds from flying tools, burns from panels that had flashed over with redirected power. A few of the wounded wore the distinct undersuit of flight crews, their helmets piled in a sad cluster at the end of a bench. Medtechs in stained smocks moved between the cots with handheld scanners and auto-injectors. Every patient, no matter their obvious injuries, got a contamination check. A beam swept from scalp to boots, calibration routines hunting for anything that didn't match baseline Terran biology. I watched one scan pulse amber for a long second over a Marine's forearm where some of the alien impact residue had splattered. The tech scrubbed the area raw, re-scan, then finally logged it as clear. The Marine's eyes never quite met the scanners. Later, when things had settled back to something like normal, we got the after-action summary. The Forge's armor had held mostly. One of the escort frigates had taken a similar hit and lost an entire forward section to sudden decompression. Rescue shuttles had salvaged who they could. The wreckage would stay in orbit as long as the Zerg didn't bother to finish it off. A new jagged satellite circling the same burning world we did. On fire control, the new breach showed up as a slight alteration in the three-dimensional model of the ship that hovered at the edge of the holodisplay. A small, darkened patch marked the damaged compartment, its internal connections grayed out, its volume effectively dead. The Forge's outline was already a patchwork of such areas, places sealed and written off, repaired with cheaper materials, never quite the same afterward. Slowly, the ship was being hollowed out from within. A shell wrapped around a shrinking core of functional space. In the berths that night, I could feel the change even with my eyes closed. The hum of the engines was the same pitch as before, but there was a new undertone riding in the metal under my back. A faint ghost of the impact that had deformed that part of the hull. The tally marks carved into the bunk frame above me were still there, but they felt less like someone else's record and more like a question hanging over my own future rows. I thought about the sealed compartment, about the Zerg biomass melted off the hull and vented into space, about whatever microscopic traces might have slipped past scanners and into filters and ductwork. The official reports insisted all contamination had been neutralized. The ship's biohazard systems had done their job. The Forge was safe. People still started watching each other a little more closely in the days that followed. A persistent cough, a patch of skin that healed slower than it should, a blank look held too long in a crowded corridor. None of it meant anything on its own, but in the tight confines of a ship that had just heard its own hull scream, every anomaly felt like a warning. We went back to firing on the world below as if nothing had changed. But as the rounds cycled and the hive clusters flared and died under our guns, I couldn't shake the sense that the war had finally reached in far enough to touch us. We'd spent so long raining death down on Zerg structures that it was easy to forget they could reach back. Now there was a mark on the forge's internal map that proved they had. Heat rolled through the lower decks like a tide the day they pushed the forge past her own limits. Even on the fire control level, 2 bulkheads away from the main reactor stacks, the air felt thicker, the vents exhaling warmth that hadn't had time to cool. Every exposed pipe and conduit along the walls hummed with the effort of feeding power to too many hungry systems at once. We had been ordered to reposition the battle group across the system on a timeline that made engineering nervous. Zerg reinforcements were pouring in from deep space, leviathans, swollen bioships, and clouds of lesser organisms riding the same vector. Somewhere further out, other Dominion assets were at risk of being swallowed. We were close enough to hit the incoming swarm or run for a new firing solution, but not both at a leisurely pace. For once, higher command had chosen retreat over glory. The Forge would execute a short-range jump deeper into the system, aligning for a later counterstrike, while the remaining escorts covered our translation. It sounded neat and clean in briefing summaries. In practice, it meant spooling up the jump drives inside a gravity well, under partial fire, with a hull that already bore fresh stress fractures. Fire control's role in the maneuver was mostly to stand down. The main batteries would be offline during the translation. All power not absolutely required for life support and jump computation was being diverted into the engines and field generators. For one rare span of minutes, our consoles displayed no surface, no hive clusters, no planetary grids, only status bars tied directly to the ship's own heart. I was seconded as a liaison to the engineering galleries for the duration. One more set of eyes to relay power priorities if something went sideways mid-process. It was the first time I'd walked that deep into the Forge's spine. The main reactor compartment was off-limits even now, its interior sealed behind thick observation panes and armored doors. But the approach galleries gave me plenty to feel. The deck vibrated at a higher frequency than on the upper levels, a constant buzzing under my boots that made my teeth itch. Heat bled through the bulkheads, turning metal surfaces into warm touch points you didn't want your skin resting on for long. Along one wall, a row of emergency coolant dump controls glowed a steady, ominous amber. Engineers moved through the space with the focused haste of people who knew exactly how much could go wrong. Their coveralls were stained with the kind of grime that never fully washed out, and every one of them wore a band of sensors around their wrist that fed directly into the ship's safety systems. If those bracelets reported readings outside expected bounds, automatic shutdown sequences could cascade through the drive complex before human hesitation had a chance to interfere. The drive spools built their charge in layers. I could feel it as a kind of pressure behind my eyes, a sense that the air itself was thickening. On a nearby display, the projected stress curves for the Forge's hull climbed steadily toward bands that had been labeled yellow on the chart, and then, in less formal handwriting, "Do not live here" on a sticky note someone had pasted beside it. On the tactical channels, the escorts reported enemy contact. Zerg strike craft were harrying the formation, testing shield coverage, looking for weak spots. The Forge's point defense grid stayed active as long as it could, plucking incoming threats out of the void, but even that had to be throttled back as the drives demanded more. There was only so much energy to go around. In the gallery, we watched the readouts instead of the battle. Hull flex measurements ticked upward as the ship held position in the star's gravity well, fighting to maintain a stable orientation while the drive field formed. Jump fields were not meant to be anchored this deep. The manuals recommended empty interstellar space, clean and forgiving, far from both gravity and incoming fire. Manuals didn't often get a say out here. Someone uprange made the call to commit. It arrived on our boards as a simple change. Field integrity threshold met. Translation solution locked. Countdown initiated. The Forge had reached the point where aborting would be as dangerous as continuing. As the count reached its last bracket, the humming in the metal around me rose to a high, needling keen. Support struts along the gallery creaked, microfractures shifting under load. The emergency coolant controls flicked to a higher alert state, their indicators now a solid, baleful red. One of the engineers near me had his gaze fixed on a single gauge that monitored core temperature. The needle had crept into a range that, during drills, existed only as a hypothetical. Then the world lurched. Jump translation always felt wrong, a moment where every direction stopped agreeing on what down meant. Under normal conditions, the dampeners and field harmonics smoothed most of that away into a brief, gut-twisting flicker. Pushing the drives this hard, inside this well, the mismatch showed its teeth. Gravity vanished for a breath, and then came back from the side. The deck heaved, shrugging us into the air and slamming us down at a slightly different angle. A tray of tools slid off a workbench and clattered across the floor in a spray of metal. Somewhere deeper in the structure, something big cracked with a boom that registered as much in the sternum as in the ears. The lights flickered. For a heartbeat, the world was lit only by emergency strips and the molten glare from the core behind the observation panes. I saw the outline of the reactor vessel in that half-dark, a massive, throbbing silhouette threaded with containment bands. The heart of the Forge beating too fast. Then the lights returned, and with them a rush of data on every display. Hull stress curves dipped downward again, not by much, but enough to clear the margins where engineering had written their little jokes. The drive field collapsed back into normal space at a new coordinate. The vectors of incoming fire reset. The escort's reports changed from contact to regroup. The star outside pulled at us from a slightly different distance. We had made the jump. The Forge had not come apart. Not completely. In the hours that followed, compartment reports painted a more complicated picture. One of the cargo bays along the midline had lost half its internal supports when a brace cracked during translation. The bay was sealed, its contents slated for later recovery or write-off. A maintenance crew in a lower corridor had been caught by a collapsing overhead panel and would not be coming back to the mess. The forward hangar lost a row of shuttle racks when mounting grips failed under the jolt. The shuttles themselves crumpled against each other like metal toys in a careless hand. Up on fire control, our systems came back online in stages. Sensors reacquired the new slice of space around us, the star now a fraction smaller, the infested world we'd been bombarding out of immediate range. The incoming Zerg formations temporarily confused by our translation. Further out, on the ragged edge of detection, something else flickered, a formation of clean, sharp-edged energy signatures that the classification routines tagged as potentially Protoss before they vanished. The bridge logged the contact as an anomaly and pushed the Forge onto a new vector. We had a brief window to breathe, to repair, to pretend the red line burn had been a controlled maneuver rather than a narrow escape. In the berths, you could tell who had been on the lower decks during the jump. They moved a little more carefully, as if their bodies were still adjusting to the idea that the floor would stay where it was supposed to. A few bunks remained empty after the next shift change. The tally marks above my head acquired new neighbors from a hand that was not the one that had started the first rows. The forge's engines settled back into their usual song, but to my ears, the tone was subtly different now. A note of strain threaded through the familiar hum. We had asked more of the ship than the design specs recommended, and gotten away with it this time. Systems could be patched, supports reinforced, readings coaxed back into acceptable ranges. Fatigue, in steel and in people, was harder to erase. Serving aboard a Dominion battlecruiser in a Zerg war zone meant living with that knowledge tucked somewhere behind your ribs, that the machines keeping you alive were being worn down faster than anyone could properly service them, and that one day the curve on a chart might climb just a little too far before someone hit the cutoff. The last world we bombarded before I stopped believing in endings was already classified as lost when we arrived. The strategic summaries called it a denied asset, a place the Dominion had decided the Zerg could not be allowed to exploit, even if no one human was walking its surface anymore. Our job was not to save it. Our job was to make sure nothing useful remained. From the bridge-adjacent observation blister, the planet filled the forward field like a diseased eye. From this angle, the night side bled red and violet where hive clusters pulsed, linked by faint bioluminescent threads that traced the arteries of infestation across continents. The day side was mottled with old impact scars, some of them ours, some from other wars fought before we got there. They rotated us through the blister in shifts, a handful of fire control techs at a time, to maintain direct coordination with the bridge during the operation. It was closer than I'd ever been to the command level, one bulkhead away from the people whose names anchored the orders in our console queues. The air up here felt cleaner, the lighting less harsh, the noise slightly more muffled, as if the ship understood that decisions made in this space should not have to shout. The Forge took up a stable firing position in low orbit, along with the remaining ships in our group. The red line burn had cost us a few escorts. Their absence was visible in the gaps between hulls drifting around the world. Other Dominion vessels had been called in to replace them, fresh paint and unscarred armor contrasting uncomfortably with the Forge's patched hide. On the tactical displays, the operation unfolded in phases. First, we targeted major hive clusters and biomass concentrations, saturating them with overlapping beams until their thermal signatures blurred into one broad smear of heat. Then we moved on to transit nodes, suspected breeding pits, and any geological features that suggested deep, protected cavities where the swarm might anchor itself again if left alone. Zerg presence pushed back against the onslaught. Leviathans clawed their way into the upper atmosphere, dragging swarms of lesser flyers in their wake. Spore impacts flared against our shields, each one a tiny punch in the ribs of the Forge's integrity. The ship's armor plating had been reinforced as much as time and materials allowed, but you could still feel each hit as a shiver in the deck, a reminder of how little separated our compartments from vacuum and chitin. Fire control worked at a pace I hadn't thought possible before. There was no time now for the hesitant second-guessing that had haunted the outpost strike. The world below was an enemy, every coordinate inside the bombardment grid deemed hostile by definition. We adjusted for atmospheric conditions, for rotational drift, for energy bleed through the crust, but not for the presence of any surviving Dominion citizens. The paperwork had decided there were none. As the operation stretched into its later stages, the Forge herself began to show the strain. Heat maps of the hull glowed brighter around the main gun mounts and along the conduits feeding the Yamato cannon capacitors. Engineering status updates arrived with more caveats. Cooling cycles extended, recommended firing intervals ignored, structural braces flexing near their calculated limits. The ship had been built for sustained fire, but not indefinitely, and not from a starting condition already eroded by too many previous campaigns. At one point, a deep, grinding vibration rolled through the observation blister. Not the sharp jolt of an impact, but a slow, drawn-out complaint from the bones of the Forge. The displays flickered, recalibrated, and returned. The hull stress diagram in the corner of my console pulsed a warning shade for several long breaths before subsiding. Outside, a Leviathan died under concentrated fire from 3 battlecruisers at once, its vast bulk tearing apart as internal structures failed. Chunks of burning biomass tumbled back into the atmosphere, leaving trails of ember-like fragments. They would feed the surface in death as they had in life. Zerg seldom wasted anything for long. Somewhere on the far side of the system, sensors picked up a brief, signature-clean flare. The classification routines tagged it as Protoss again, a warp event, the kind their ships left when they stepped cleanly between points faster than even our jumps could manage. The contact came and went without any sign of approach. It felt less like another fleet entering the arena and more like a distant observer stepping into the doorway, watching and stepping away. Word of that contact trickled down through informal channels faster than any official report. In the observation blister, one of the junior officers shifted his gaze toward the starboard emptiness where the signal had been, his jaw tightening a fraction. For all that the Zerg were our immediate problem, there was an unspoken understanding aboard the Forge now that we were operating between 2 inhuman judgments, one that devoured and one that erased. The bombardment continued until the Zerg biosignatures on the planetary overlay fell below a threshold someone had chosen in a room far from here. It wasn't 0. It would never be 0. Even with the crust cracked and the atmosphere boiling in places, patches of stubborn life clung on in shadows and depths we couldn't reach without tearing the world entirely apart. When the ceasefire order came, it arrived as a cascading series of stand-down tags on our consoles. One by one, weapon banks cycled into safe states. Capacitors began slow, careful discharge routines. Cooling systems ramped up, vents along the Forge's flanks opening to spill built-up heat into space in shimmering waves that distorted the stars behind them. In the blister, we watched the world turn. Large swaths of it glowed a dull, angry red where the bombardment had been heaviest, and high-altitude smoke bands already circled the globe like dark rings. From this distance, there was no way to see the smaller details, the shattered hive spires, the glassed riverbeds, the ruined skeletons of whatever Terran infrastructure had once stood there. All of it blurred together into one wounded sphere. The operation logs categorized the result as a success. The Zerg's capacity to use the planet as a staging ground had been significantly degraded. Strategic projections showed ripple effects in their logistical chains. This system was no longer prioritized as critically as others. The Forge got her next orders less than a day later. They arrived with the usual bureaucratic phrasing, chains of code and designation that boiled down to a familiar truth. Another contested region, another line that needed holding, another set of coordinates where our presence was required. The ship would conduct minimal field repairs, take on whatever supplies could be shuttled from an automated depot in the outer system, and then jump onward. No shipyard, no dock, never docks. On the lower decks, the memorial wall in the corridor outside the mess received another plate. The blank sheet that had been waiting after the outpost strike was now almost full. New names etched in with the same handheld tool marks as the old ones. The cracked marine helmet remained on its shelf, joined by a tech's burned-out console interface and a set of dog tags someone had hung on a hook. In the berths, our row felt thinner. A bunk that had been occupied since before my arrival stayed empty through 2 rotations, its curtain tied back, its minor personal clutter cleared. The tally marks above it were abruptly capped, their last incomplete row frozen where the hand that had carved them had stopped. Someone would be assigned to that space eventually. Space on the Forge never stayed unused for long. On fire control, we filed the planetary data under completed operations and opened fresh files for the systems ahead. The holotable cleared the image of the wounded world with a simple command, its surface shifting back to the color-coded abstractions of nav routes and engagement envelopes. A part of me resented how easily that happened, how quickly the display moved on. Later, off watch, I stood alone in the observation blister for a while. The planet we had just burned slid out of the window's field as the Forge adjusted her attitude for the next jump. Stars took its place, indifferent pinpricks cast across a black that would outlast every war we fought in it. I pressed my fingertips against the transparent armor of the viewport and felt the faint, steady vibration of the ship beneath the surface. It was the same pulse I'd felt since the day I arrived, layered now with new undertones from breaches, jumps, and bombardments. The Forge carried her history in her frame. Scars, patches, hollowed-out sections, reinforced ribs. Serving aboard a Dominion battlecruiser in a Zerg Warzone, I had come to realize, meant living inside a weapon that never fully cooled and never truly rested. We marked our time in firing cycles and jump burns, in memorial plates and tally scratches, in the quiet spaces between alarms where we pretended our routines were life, and not merely the maintenance of readiness. When the jump call finally went out, I left the blister and made my way back down through the ship's arteries. In the berth, I lay back on my bunk with my boots still on, feeling the hum build as the drives spun up again. Above me, the carved tallies waited for their next row. Somewhere ahead, there was another world already half lost, another set of coordinates that would appear on our screens as code before becoming scars on someone else's sky. The Forge would go there. So would I until something finally cracked in the hull or in me. The ship never docked. The war never ended. All we could do was ride the cycle and pretend, for as long as we were counted among the living, that the next jump would land us somewhere we could survive a little longer.